The gunshot echoed through the canyon, sharp and unforgiving as the Wyoming winter. Jackson Lawson didn't feel the pain at first, just the violent jolt that spun him halfway around before he collapsed into the dust, blood blossoming across his worn buckskin jacket. The stagecoach he'd been defending continued its frantic escape, the driver wisely choosing not to stop for a fallen guard. Through blurring vision, Jackson watched the bandits retreat, apparently satisfied with the strongbox they'd managed to snatch during the chaos. They hadn't counted on him putting up such a fight, and he hadn't counted on taking a bullet. Wyoming Territory, 1876. The year the nation celebrated its centennial, and Jackson Lawson contemplated bleeding to death beside a lonely stretch of road. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself, pressing a trembling hand against his left shoulder. The blood was warm and sticky between his fingers, a stark contrast to the chill settling into his bones. 29 years old and dying in the dirt, not exactly the heroic end he'd imagined. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him reach weakly for his fallen colt, but his fingers refused to cooperate. If the bandits were returning to finish him off, he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of begging. Jackson Lawson had his pride, if nothing else, but it wasn't the bandits. "Good Lord," a female voice sharp with shock. "Hold on, mister, just hold on." The world swam in and out of focus as delicate hands rolled him onto his back. The last thing Jackson saw before darkness claimed him was a pair of fierce green eyes beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and a curtain of copper hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. When Jackson awoke, the shooting pain in his shoulder confirmed he wasn't dead. The soft bed beneath him suggested he wasn't in his usual quarters above the livery stable, either. Blinking against the golden lamplight, he took in his surroundings: a small but tidy bedroom with calico curtains and a braided rug beside the bed. "Don't move." The same voice from the road, lower now, controlled. "You'll start bleeding again." She came into view, carrying a steaming basin of water. Those green eyes assessed him critically, professional rather than compassionate. Not a girl, but a woman mid-20s perhaps, dressed simply in a high-necked blouse and dark skirt. The copper hair was tamed now, pinned back from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the stern set of her mouth. "Where am I?" Jackson's voice emerged as a croak. "My homestead." "About 3 miles from where you decided to play hero." She set the basin down and wrung out a cloth. "I'm Zora Whitaker. Jackson Lawson." "Well, Mr. Lawson, you're lucky that bullet went clean through. Any deeper and you'd be having a conversation with St. Peter right now." She pressed the cloth against his wound, making him hiss through clenched teeth. "I've cleaned and bandaged it as best I could, but you've lost a lot of blood." Jackson tried to sit up, only to have Zora push him firmly back down. Despite her slender frame, she was surprisingly strong, or he was weaker than he'd thought. "The stagecoach made it to Twin Rivers safely, according to my neighbor who passed through this morning. Now lie still." She changed the bandage with practiced efficiency, her touch clinical and impersonal. "The sheriff's been notified. He'll want a statement when you're able." Jackson studied her as she worked, noting the tiny lines around her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows that suggested a habitual frown. "You live out here alone," something flashed across her face, wariness perhaps. "That's not your concern. Just making conversation, madam, save your strength." She secured the fresh bandage and stood. "You'll stay until you can ride without reopening that wound." "I've put a telegram through to your employer at the stage line." "How did you—" "Your jacket had company identification." She gathered her supplies. "Rest now. There's water beside you if you get thirsty." She left without another word, closing the door softly behind her. Jackson stared at the ceiling, puzzling over the woman who'd saved his life, yet seemed almost resentful of his presence. He'd encountered all sorts in his years, drifting through the West-hardened frontierswomen, refined Eastern transplants, brazen saloon girls, but Zora Whitaker didn't fit neatly into any category he recognized. One thing was certain: she didn't want him there. and as soon as he could stay upright in a saddle, he'd oblige her by leaving. 3 days passed in a haze of fever and fitful sleep. Zora appeared at regular intervals to change his bandages and force bitter-tasting medicinal teas down his throat, but conversation remained minimal. On the fourth morning, Jackson woke clear-headed for the first time, the worst of the fever broken. Sunlight streamed through the curtains as he gingerly pushed himself upright. His shoulder throbbed dully beneath the bandages, but the searing pain had subsided. Testing his limits, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, waiting for the room to stop spinning before attempting to stand. The sound of a piano drifted through the closed door, hesitant at first, then gaining confidence. A simple melody, played with surprising skill. Jackson found his shirt draped over a nearby chair, clean and neatly mended where the bullet had torn through. He pulled it on awkwardly, favoring his injured shoulder, then made his way to the door. The main room of the homestead was larger than he expected, dominated by a piano against one wall. Zora sat with her back to him, copper hair falling loose down her back, fingers moving across the keys with practiced grace. She wore a simple blue dress, and in the morning light she looked younger, softer somehow. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, unwilling to interrupt. The music spoke of a gentleness he hadn't witnessed in his taciturn hostess, and he found himself curious about the contradiction. The final notes faded and Zora's shoulders tensed. Without turning, she said, "You should be resting." "I've been resting for days." Jackson moved carefully into the room. "That was beautiful. It's just a habit." She closed the piano lid decisively and stood, all business once more. "Since you're up, you should try to eat something substantial." The homestead was modest, but well-maintained, a large main room serving as kitchen and parlor combined, with the bedroom he'd occupied and presumably another for Zora. Large windows let in ample light, and a collection of books suggested she wasn't merely surviving on this isolated homestead but had created a genuine home. "You play very well," Jackson said, lowering himself gingerly into a chair at the kitchen table. "Where did you learn?" Zora busied herself at the stove. "Boston, another lifetime ago." She offered no further explanation, and Jackson didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they'd left behind, himself included. After serving him a bowl of hearty stew, she sat across from him with a cup of coffee, watching him eat. "Your fever's broken," she observed. "The wound's healing clean. Another week and you should be fit to travel." Jackson paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "A week? I can't impose on you that long. I need to get back to work. The stage line's been informed. Your job will wait." Her tone brooked no argument. "Unless you're eager to tear that shoulder open again and bleed to death after all my efforts to keep you alive." He couldn't help but smile at her bluntness. "When you put it that way, I suppose I owe you a week." Something like surprise flickered in her eyes, perhaps at his easy acquiescence or perhaps at his smile. She looked away, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "I need to ride into town for supplies tomorrow," she said after a moment. "You'll be all right on your own for a few hours." "I've been taking care of myself since I was 16, madam. I think I can manage." She nodded, then hesitated. "I should warn you, I keep a loaded shotgun by the door and I'm not above using it. Should anyone come calling while I'm gone." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Are you expecting trouble out here? Always." She rose to collect his empty bowl. "Rest while you can, Mr. Lawson. Tomorrow I'll need your help with chores you can manage one-handed." So began an uneasy coexistence. True to her word, Zora put Jackson to work as soon as she deemed him strong enough. Simple tasks that wouldn't strain his healing shoulder but would, as she put it, earn his keep. He chopped vegetables, fed chickens, and mended tack while she handled the heavier work around the small homestead. They settled into a routine of sorts, meals taken in near silence, broken occasionally by practical questions. Evenings spent with Zora reading by lamplight, while Jackson whittled a hobby that required only one good arm and helped pass the long hours. She never played the piano again in his presence. though sometimes he woke in the night to hear the faint melody drifting through the walls. On the 5th day, Jackson ventured to the barn where his horse had been stabled. The big bay gelding nickered in greeting as Jackson offered an apple from Zora's small orchard. "Been treated well, have you?" he murmured, stroking the animal's velvety nose. "Better than your master, I'd wager." "He's a fine horse." Zora's voice came from behind him. "Deserves an owner with better judgment." Jackson turned to find her watching from the barn entrance, a basket of eggs balanced on one hip. The morning sunlight caught in her hair, creating a halo effect that softened her usual severe appearance. "You don't think much of what I did defending that stage," he observed. "I think you're lucky to be alive." She stepped into the shadowy barn, one man against 4 outlaws. Those aren't odds any sane person would take. The driver had a woman and child aboard, and those men weren't just after the strongbox, they were Harlan Pike's gang. Jackson watched her face carefully. "They've been terrorizing stagecoaches all through the territory, 3 people dead already." Something shifted in Zora's expression at the mention of Pike's name, a tightening around her eyes, a slight paling beneath her freckles. "You know of them," Jackson said. "It wasn't a question. Everyone knows of Pike's gang." She turned away, fussing unnecessarily with the horse's mane. "Their reputation precedes them. They'll be caught eventually, the law's closing in." Zora gave a short, humorless laugh. "The law, out here, Mr. Lawson, the law is an abstract concept at best. Justice is what a man makes with his own hands." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Jackson stepped closer, curious despite himself. "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." She faced him then, those green eyes hard as emeralds. "We all have our reasons for ending up where we are. I don't ask about yours, so kindly extend me the same courtesy." Before he could respond, she strode past him out of the barn, leaving the scent of lavender soap in her wake. That evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing howling winds that rattled the homestead's windows. Jackson helped Zora secure the shutters and bring in extra firewood before the heavens opened. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, listening to the rain hammering on the roof. "Will your crops survive this?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence that had persisted since their encounter in the barn. Zora looked up from her mending. "They've weathered worse. This land is resilient." "Like its owner," he said softly. She met his gaze, the firelight dancing across her features. For once, she didn't look away or change the subject. "Necessity breeds resilience, Mr. Lawson. I imagine you understand that better than most." Jackson nodded slowly. "My father used to say hardship either breaks a person or forges them stronger. And which did it do to you?" The question seemed to surprise her as much as him, as if she hadn't meant to express interest. He considered it, rotating his injured shoulder carefully. "Still being determined, I expect." A particularly violent gust rattled the windows, making the flames dance wildly in the fireplace. Zora set aside her mending and crossed to check that the shutters were secure. As she returned, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, and she stumbled slightly. Jackson was on his feet instantly, his good arm steadying her. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could see the tiny flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. Then she stepped back, composing herself. "Thank you," she said formally. "Miss Whitaker," he began, then corrected himself. "Zora. I know you've no reason to trust a stranger, but I'd like to think we could at least be friendly while I'm here." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Friendly," she repeated, as if testing an unfamiliar word. It might make the next few days less awkward. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting strange shadows across the walls. In that brief, stark light, Jackson thought he saw something vulnerable cross Zora's face, a loneliness that matched the isolated homestead. "I'm not in the habit of entertaining guests, Mr. Lawson." "Jackson," he corrected gently. "And I'm not asking for entertainment, just conversation, maybe even a smile if it wouldn't pain you too greatly." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "You're impertinent when you're healing. It's been noted before." He smiled, encouraged by the slight thaw. "Tell me about your piano. It's not a common sight in homesteads this far west." Zora hesitated, then gestured for him to sit. She took her own chair, arranging her skirts with deliberate care. "It was my mother's. My father had it shipped from Boston when we moved to the Wyoming territory, cost him a small fortune in transportation alone." A shadow crossed her face. "He said this wild country needed civilizing influences, music, books, proper manners. Your parents no longer live here." Jackson asked carefully. "They're buried on the hill behind the orchard." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. "5 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry, it happens out here." She stared into the fire. "Life is precarious, people come and go." "And you stayed, alone. This is my home." The simple declaration held a wealth of determination. "I wasn't going to let it go without a fight." Jackson recognized the steel beneath her words, the same unflinching resolve that had kept her working this homestead single-handedly, that had made her stop for a bleeding stranger on a dangerous road. "It's a fine place," he said sincerely. "You've done well with it." She looked up, surprise evident in her expression, as if compliments were rare currency in her world. "Thank you." The storm raged on outside, but inside, something had shifted. Not friendship exactly, but an understanding. Two solitary souls finding brief respite in each other's company while the elements unleashed their fury. The next morning dawned clear and clean, the storm having washed away the dust and left the landscape glistening. Jackson woke early, shoulder aching from the change in weather, but otherwise feeling stronger than he had since the shooting. He dressed and made his way outside, finding Zora already at work assessing storm damage. She wore trousers and a man's work shirt, her hair braided practically down her back, attire that would raise eyebrows in town but was eminently practical for farm work. She looked up as Jackson approached, nodding in greeting. "Fence is down along the south pasture," she said without preamble. "The cows will be out if we don't mend it quickly." "Lead the way," Jackson replied, falling into step beside her. They worked together efficiently, Zora handling the heavier posts while Jackson steadied them, his good arm proving useful despite his injury. The morning sun grew warm on their backs as they completed the repairs, driving the last stake into the rain-softened ground. "That should hold," Zora said, wiping her brow with her sleeve. She studied Jackson with a critical eye. "Your shoulder's troubling you, it's nothing." But the pain had intensified with the exertion, and he couldn't quite hide his wince as he straightened. Zora frowned. "Inside, I need to check the bandages." Back in the homestead's kitchen, Jackson sat shirtless on a stool while Zora examined his wound. Her touch was gentle despite her brusque manner, fingers probing carefully around the angry red scar where the bullet had torn through muscle and flesh. "It's healing," she pronounced. "But it'll need proper rest to mend correctly. No more fence building for a few days." Jackson grimaced as she applied a fresh poultice. "Will it heal straight, do you think?" Zora's hands stilled momentarily. "No," she said honestly. "It will heal crooked. The bullet damaged the muscle too severely for it to knit back perfectly." She resumed her work, wrapping clean bandages around his shoulder. "You'll have full use of the arm eventually, but you'll know when rain's coming, and it will ache in the cold." Jackson nodded, absorbing this. Another scar, another permanent reminder of choices made and consequences faced. "It'll heal crooked," he repeated. "So did my heart." The words were so soft he almost missed them. When he turned to look at her, Zora's face was composed, but something in her eyes had changed. A door cracked open that had previously been firmly shut. "What happened?" he asked quietly. She finished securing the bandage before answering, her movements methodical. Then she sat across from him at the kitchen table, hands folded before her like a schoolgirl about to recite a lesson. 3 years ago, I was engaged to be married, Jeffrey Barrett, the son of a cattle baron from the next county. Her voice was steady, emotionless. My parents were gone, and I was struggling to maintain the homestead alone. Jeffrey promised security, partnership. I believed him. She paused, her eyes fixed on some middle distance beyond the kitchen wall. 2 weeks before the wedding, Pike's gang raided Barrett's main ranch. They killed 3 ranch hands and stole a valuable shipment of breeding stock. Jeffrey organized a posse to hunt them down. Her hands tightened on each other. They caught up to the gang at Serpent's Pass. There was a gunfight. Jeffrey was killed. Jackson remained silent, watching the careful control with which she told the story. Afterward, I learned that he'd mortgaged this homestead, my homestead, without my knowledge or consent, used it as collateral for a business venture that died with him. Her chin lifted slightly. His father offered to honor the debt by taking the land. I refused. I've spent 3 years working every day to pay it off instead. You could have sold, Jackson observed. Started fresh somewhere else. This land is all I have left of my family. The simple statement explained everything about her: the isolation, the wariness, the fierce independence. And Pike, Jackson asked carefully, he's still out there. Something hard flashed in her eyes. The law couldn't find them or wouldn't look hard enough. Barrett Sr. has powerful friends, but even they couldn't bring Pike to justice. Jackson understood then why his mention of Pike's gang had struck such a chord, why she'd been so disapproving of his lone stand against the outlaws. That's why you saved me, he said with sudden clarity. Even knowing I'd put myself in danger foolishly, because I stood against Pike. Zora looked away. I would have stopped for anyone wounded on that road. But you wouldn't have cared quite so much if they lived, Jackson pressed gently. Her silence was confirmation enough. Thank you, he said simply, for telling me, for saving my life. Don't make me regret either. She stood abruptly, ending the conversation. There's stew left from yesterday. You should eat something, then rest that shoulder. As she turned to go, Jackson caught her wrist lightly. Zora. I'm sorry about Jeffrey, about all of it. For a moment, she allowed the contact, her pulse fluttering beneath his fingers like a captured bird. Then she withdrew her hand and nodded once before walking away. That evening, after they'd eaten in companionable silence, Zora disappeared into her bedroom. Jackson sat by the fire, contemplating all he'd learned. The pieces of Zora Whitaker were starting to fit together: her determination to survive alone, her distrust of strangers, her hatred of Pike's gang. A woman shaped by loss and betrayal, fighting daily battles most men would find daunting. The soft notes of the piano startled him from his thoughts. He listened as Zora played not the simple melody from before, but something more complex and deeply melancholy. A piece that spoke of longing and regret. Moving quietly, Jackson approached the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the crack, he could see Zora at a smaller piano than the one in the main room, a practice instrument, perhaps. Her eyes were closed as she played, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Jackson withdrew without making his presence known, returning to his chair by the fire. Some grief was too private to witness. The next day passed in quiet routine. Jackson's shoulder was indeed too sore for heavy work, so he occupied himself with tasks around the kitchen while Zora tended the animals and checked her fields. The storm had flattened some crops but spared others. She returned midday looking tired but relieved. We were lucky, she said, washing up at the pump outside the back door. The wheat's salvageable and the vegetable garden mostly survived. Good news, Jackson replied, leaning against the doorframe. I've made lunch if you're hungry. Surprise registered on her face. You cook. Don't sound so astonished. A man traveling alone either learns to cook or starves, he grinned. Though I won't claim it's anything fancy. The simple beef stew and biscuits he'd prepared seemed to meet with her approval. They ate outside on the small porch, watching hawks circle lazily in the brilliant blue sky. Have you always worked for the stage line? Zora asked, breaking their companionable silence. Jackson shook his head. No, that's recent. I've done a bit of everything: cowboying, scouting for the army, even some prospecting up in Montana. He smiled ruefully. Never found that mother lode, though. What brought you to Wyoming? The usual. New horizons, fresh start. He shrugged his good shoulder. I spent my youth restless, moving whenever the mood struck. Wyoming's the first place that's felt like it might be worth staying. Despite the obvious hazards, she observed dryly, life's full of hazards, no matter where you settle. Jackson studied her profile as she looked out across her land. At least here the dangers are honest. A man generally knows what he's facing. Zora turned to meet his gaze. Is that why you confronted those bandits? Because it was an honest danger. I confronted them because it was the right thing to do. He held her eyes steadily. Same reason you stopped to help a bleeding stranger, even knowing it might bring Pike's attention to your doorstep. She looked away first, but not before Jackson caught the faint blush coloring her cheeks. You give me too much credit. It was simple human decency. Simple human decency seems in short supply these days, makes it all the more valuable when found. The afternoon stretched before them, golden and tranquil. For the first time since his arrival, Jackson felt truly at ease in Zora's company, and unless he was mistaken, she felt the same. The wary tension that had characterized their early interactions had mellowed into something approaching friendship. As the sun began its westward descent, a plume of dust on the distant road caught Jackson's attention. Someone's coming, he said, straightening. Riding hard. Zora followed his gaze, frowning. Stay here, she instructed, disappearing inside only to return moments later with a rifle. Expecting trouble? Jackson asked, moving to stand beside her despite her directive. I told you before out here always. Her voice was tense, her body poised like a drawn bowstring as the rider approached. It soon became clear there was only one horseman, and as he drew nearer, Jackson could make out a badge glinting on his vest. The rider reined in before the house, a stocky man in his 50s with a grizzled beard and the weathered look of a frontier lawman. Miss Whitaker, he called, touching the brim of his hat. Sheriff Thomas Reeves from Twin Rivers, I understand you've been harboring a wounded stage guard. I've been offering medical assistance to a man shot in the line of duty, Zora corrected coolly. This is Mr. Lawson. The sheriff's shrewd eyes assessed Jackson. Glad to see you up and about, son. When we found that blood trail and no body, we feared the worst. As you can see, Sheriff, I'm on the mend, Jackson said, thanks entirely to Miss Whitaker's care. Well, you might want to cut that recovery short. Reeves dismounted stiffly. Pike's gang hit another stage yesterday, 20 miles south. Killed the driver outright, but a passenger recognized one of the bandits' same man you wounded before they fled from your stage. Jackson felt Zora tense beside him. They're still in the area, she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Seems so. Word is they've been asking about a stage guard who got away. The sheriff's gaze shifted between them, specifically one who might have been helped by a woman with red hair. Cold dread settled in Jackson's stomach. They know I'm here. It's a possibility we can't ignore. Reeves removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. Miss Whitaker, I'd advise you both to come into town until we can organize a proper posse. Pike's not known for leaving loose ends, and he particularly doesn't like witnesses. I'm not abandoning my home, Zora said firmly. Madam, with all due respect, she's right, Jackson interrupted. If we leave, they'll burn the place to the ground out of pure spite. I've seen Pike's handiwork before, the sheriff sighed heavily. Then at least accept some reinforcement. I can spare 2 deputies. No. Jackson's decision crystallized with sudden clarity. This is my fight, Sheriff. I drew their attention here. I'll deal with the consequences. That's suicide, son. Not if we're smart about it. Jackson turned to Zora. Unless you want me gone, say the word and I'll ride out with the sheriff. Zora looked at him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face as if seeking the answer to a complex equation. Finally, she shook her head. This is my fight too, she said quietly. Has been for 3 years. The sheriff looked between them, then shook his head in resignation. I can see you've made up your minds. I'll send word when the posse is organized, but it might take a few days to gather enough men willing to go against Pike. He remounted his horse. In the meantime, stay vigilant. They could come anytime. After the sheriff departed, Jackson and Zora stood silently on the porch, watching the dust settle on the distant road. "You should have gone with him," Zora said finally. "Your shoulder's not healed enough for what's coming. And leave you to face them alone." Jackson shook his head. "Not a chance. I've managed on my own for 3 years. This isn't about your competence," he said gently. "It's about not having to face every battle alone just because you can." Something shifted in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or a deeper understanding. "Why would you risk your life for a homestead that isn't yours? For a woman you barely know?" Jackson considered the question seriously. "Partly because I brought this trouble to your door, partly because Pike's gang needs stopping and has for too long." He met her gaze steadily. "And partly because, in a week's time, I've come to care what happens to you, Zora Whitaker." Her lips parted slightly, but whatever response she might have made was interrupted by the dinner bell she'd hung outside the kitchen, now ringing wildly in a wind that wasn't blowing. "Inside," Jackson said sharply, drawing the pistol he'd reclaimed from his belongings. "Someone's out there." They retreated into the house, securing doors and shutters. Jackson positioned himself by a window with a clear view of the approach to the homestead, while Zora checked her rifle and gathered additional ammunition. "There," she whispered, pointing toward the edge of the orchard where a shadow moved between the trees. "At least one." Jackson nodded grimly. "They're scouting. Probably won't attack until nightfall, unless they want to burn us out in daylight. Pike's too cautious for that. Smoke can be seen for miles. He'd risk drawing attention." Jackson winced as he shifted position, his shoulder protesting the strain. "We need to prepare." As the afternoon waned, they worked methodically, moving furniture to create defensive positions, filling buckets with water in case of fire, loading every firearm in the house. Throughout it all, Zora maintained the same composed determination she brought to every task, but Jackson noticed the slight tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. "We'll get through this," he said softly as they finished their preparations. Zora looked up at him, fear and resolve mingled in her expression. "You can't promise that." "No," he conceded, "but I can promise I won't leave you to face it alone." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting both the limitation and the vow. As dusk gathered, they ate a cold supper, neither particularly hungry but both aware they needed strength for what lay ahead. Jackson insisted Zora try to rest while he took the first watch, promising to wake her in a few hours. "I won't sleep," she objected. "Try anyway," he said gently. "We need you sharp." To his surprise, she complied, settling on the sofa positioned away from the windows. Jackson resumed his vigil, watching as darkness claimed the land, transforming familiar shapes into potential threats. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a persistent reminder of his vulnerability. An hour passed in tense silence. Then another. The moon rose, casting silvery light across the yard. Nothing moved except the occasional night bird or the shadow of branches stirred by the breeze. "Anything?" Zora's voice came from behind him. She'd risen silently, moving to his side with a stealth that impressed him. "Nothing yet, but they're out there." He was certain of it, could feel the malevolent presence like a storm front approaching. "You should rest longer." "I've rested enough." She knelt beside him at the window, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap in her hair. "Jackson, if this goes badly, it won't," he interrupted, unwilling to hear whatever fatalistic sentiment she was about to express. "If it does," she persisted, "I want you to know I'm grateful. Not just for staying now, but for—" She hesitated, searching for words. "For reminding me what it's like not to be alone." The simple admission touched him more deeply than any flowery declaration could have. He reached out, brushing a strand of copper hair from her cheek. "When this is over," he said softly, "I'd like to keep reminding you if you'd let me." Her eyes widened slightly, surprise giving way to something warmer. Before she could respond, a flicker of movement in the yard caught Jackson's attention. "They're here," he whispered, drawing back from the window. "At least 3 by the barn. Probably more circling around back." Zora nodded, all personal matters forgotten as she checked her rifle one last time. What's their likely approach? They'll try to draw us out if they can. Failing that, they might. The crash of breaking glass from the back of the house interrupted him. Seconds later, a flaming object sailed through the shattered window, landing on the kitchen floor where it immediately began spreading fire to the curtains. Go. Jackson urged, covering Zora as she ran to douse the flames with one of their prepared buckets. A second missile followed the first, but she was ready, smothering it with a wet blanket before it could ignite anything substantial. Gunshots erupted from multiple directions, bullets splintering wood and embedding in the walls. Jackson returned fire through the window, aiming at muzzle flashes in the darkness. He heard a cry of pain, then a volley of cursing. "Got one," he muttered, ducking as return fire intensified. Zora had taken position at the back window, her rifle steady as she scanned for targets. The controlled way she handled the weapon spoke of practice and determination rather than experience in firefights, but she was holding her own. "They're trying to surround us," she called, firing twice in rapid succession. Jackson knew she was right. It was a standard tactic: pin down your quarry, then close the noose. With his injured shoulder limiting his mobility and only the two of them defending, the odds were grim. A sudden, eerie silence fell. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the soft crackling of small fires they hadn't quite extinguished and the pounding of blood in Jackson's ears. "Jackson Lawson," a voice called from the darkness. "We know you're in there, the woman too." Jackson exchanged a glance with Zora, who had gone very still. "You've got one chance," the voice continued. "Send out the guard who saw our faces and the woman can live, otherwise you both burn with the house." "That's Pike," Zora whispered, her face pale in the dim light. "I recognize his voice." Jackson nodded grimly. "I'm not going out there and neither are you. They'll kill us both regardless." "I know." She moved closer, her shoulder brushing his. "But they don't know about the cellar." Jackson stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment, then understood as she continued urgently. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen. The entrance is hidden under the rug. It leads to a tunnel that comes out in the orchard, my father's precaution against Indian raids years ago." Her eyes held his intently. "If we can reach it without them seeing." "We can circle behind them," Jackson finished. It was risky they'd be exposed while crossing to the kitchen, but with the alternative being a slow death by fire or bullets, the choice was clear. "I'll cover you," he said. "Get to the cellar, I'll follow." "No." Zora's hand gripped his arm. "Your shoulder, you'll never manage the ladder one-handed. We go together." Before he could argue, she raised her voice to call out to the attackers. "We need time to discuss your offer, Pike. 5 minutes." A harsh laugh answered her. 2 minutes, red, then we start lighting torches. Using the brief reprieve, they moved swiftly through the house, staying low. Jackson kept his pistol ready as Zora pulled back the kitchen rug, revealing a trapdoor set flush with the floorboards. She lifted it silently, gesturing for Jackson to descend first into the darkness below. The climb down was agony for his injured shoulder, but he managed it, gritting his teeth against the pain. Zora followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them just as shouts indicated the attackers' patience had run out. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and preserved vegetables. Zora fumbled with matches, lighting a small lantern that cast long shadows across the cramped space. "This way," she whispered, leading him toward a narrow tunnel braced with timber supports. "Stay close." They moved as quickly as the confined space allowed, bent almost double. Above them, muffled by earth and floorboards, came the sounds of breaking glass and men's shouts. The attack on the now empty house had begun in earnest. The tunnel seemed endless, the air growing thinner as they progressed. Jackson's shoulders screamed in protest at the awkward position, but he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. Finally, Zora halted before a crude wooden ladder leading up to a trapdoor similar to the one they'd entered through. "We're beneath the apple tree at the edge of the orchard," she breathed. "About 50 yards from the house." Jackson nodded, conserving his strength. "I'll go first. If it's clear, I'll help you up." The trapdoor was heavy, covered with years of fallen leaves and debris carefully arranged to conceal its existence. Jackson pushed it open just enough to survey their surroundings. Moonlight revealed the homestead ablaze, flames leaping from windows as Pike's men circled it like vultures. From this vantage point, Jackson counted 5 attackers more than he'd hoped, fewer than he'd feared. "Now," he whispered, pushing the door fully open and hauling himself out with his good arm. Pain lanced through his shoulder, but adrenaline dulled the worst of it as he reached back to help Zora emerge from the tunnel. They crouched behind the broad trunk of the apple tree, assessing the situation. The outlaws' attention was focused entirely on the burning house, clearly believing their quarry trapped inside. "We need horses," Jackson muttered. Their mounts were stabled in the barn, now separated from them by 50 yards of open ground and 5 armed men. "There's another way," Zora replied. "My nearest neighbor keeps horses in the south pasture, beyond those trees." She pointed to a copse of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile distant. "If we can reach it undetected." A shout from near the house interrupted their planning. One of Pike's men had noticed the open trapdoor beside the kitchen garden their escape route discovered. "Run," Jackson urged, pushing Zora toward the cottonwoods. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you," she insisted, tugging at his arm. The first shots kicked up dirt near their feet as 2 outlaws spotted them and opened fire. There was no more time for discussion. They ran together, weaving through the orchard trees for cover, heading for the dubious safety of the distant cottonwoods. Behind them, the homestead continued to burn, illuminating the night with an angry orange glow. Zora didn't look back, focusing grimly on the path ahead, but Jackson felt her anguish as tangibly as his own pain. Everything she'd fought to preserve was being reduced to ashes behind them. They reached the edge of the orchard, with only open pastureland between them and the cottonwoods. The moon had slipped behind clouds, providing some cover in the darkness, but crossing open ground with armed pursuers was a desperate gamble. "Stay low," Jackson instructed. "Move fast and don't stop for anything." They broke from the cover of the last apple tree, running in a half-crouch across the open field. They'd covered perhaps half the distance when gunshots rang out behind them. A bullet whistled past Jackson's ear. Another tore through Zora's skirt without striking flesh. They were almost to the cottonwoods when Jackson heard the thunder of approaching hooves, not from behind, but from ahead. His heart sank, thinking Pike had positioned men to cut off their escape, but as the riders emerged from the trees, he recognized the glint of badges in the moonlight. "Sheriff's posse," he gasped to Zora. "We're saved." The lawmen rode past them, guns drawn, heading for the burning homestead and the outlaws who now found themselves caught between fleeing quarry and approaching justice. More gunshots echoed across the pasture as the posse engaged Pike's gang. Jackson and Zora stumbled into the shelter of the cottonwoods, collapsing against a tree trunk, breathing heavily. In the distance, the firefight continued, punctuated by shouts and the occasional scream. "They came," Zora said wonderingly. "The sheriff actually formed a posse." "Sounds like they're earning their pay," Jackson agreed, wincing as he shifted his injured shoulder. The wound had reopened during their flight, blood seeping through his shirt. Zora noticed immediately, moving to examine it in the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. "You're bleeding again. It's nothing compared to what might have happened." He caught her hand as she pressed it against the wound. "Zora, I'm sorry about your home." Her face was streaked with soot, her copper hair wild around her shoulders, yet in that moment she looked more beautiful to Jackson than any society belle in her finery. "It's just a house," she said finally. "It can be rebuilt." Before he could respond, riders approached through the cottonwoods. Sheriff Reeves and 2 deputies, their expressions grim but satisfied. "Miss Whitaker, Mr. Lawson," the sheriff greeted them, dismounting stiffly. "Glad to see you both alive. When we saw the house ablaze, we feared the worst." Pike, Jackson asked tersely, dead along with two of his men. The others surrendered, Reeves spat to one side. Been a long time coming. Zora swayed slightly and Jackson steadied her with his good arm. The sheriff noticed, his weathered face softening with concern. You both need medical attention. Town's not far, we can have you there in an hour. In the aftermath, events seemed to blur together. The ride to Twin Rivers, the doctor treating Jackson's reopened wound and Zora's various cuts and bruises, the statements given to the sheriff about the attack. Through it all, Jackson remained acutely aware of Zora's quiet presence, her composure remarkable given all she had lost. It was nearly dawn when they were finally left alone in the sheriff's office, waiting for arrangements to be made for their accommodation. Jackson sat beside Zora on a hard wooden bench, his arm in a fresh sling, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. She stared at her hands for a long moment before answering. "Rebuild, I suppose. The land is still mine, even if everything on it is gone." "It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." She looked up at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "At least Pike is finished. There's some justice in that." Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of all that had happened and all that remained unsaid between them. "Zora, back at the house before the attack, you were about to say something." She held his gaze steadily. "So were you. I meant it," he said simply. "When this is over, I'd like to keep reminding you what it's like not to be alone, if you'll have me." "My heart healed crooked, Jackson." Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this." "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I'd like to try, together." For the first time since he'd met her, Zora Whitaker smiled fully, a genuine expression that transformed her face and reached her eyes. "I think I'd like that too." 3 months later, the new homestead was taking shape. The main house was smaller than the original but sturdier, built with the help of neighbors who had rallied around Zora after the attack. The barn had been the first structure completed, providing shelter for livestock through the approaching winter. Jackson stood on the porch, testing the weight on his healing shoulder. The doctor had been right, he had nearly full use of the arm now, though it ached when rain was coming and would never be as strong as before. A small price to pay, he reflected, for the life he'd found. Inside, he could hear Zora playing the piano, not her mother's grand instrument, which had been lost in the fire, but a smaller one donated by the banker's wife in town. The melody was cheerful today, matching the bright autumn sunshine. The past months hadn't been easy. Rebuilding required back-breaking labor and more money than either of them possessed individually. But the death of Pike had made Jackson something of a local hero, earning him a substantial reward from the stage line and offers of permanent employment with better pay. He'd accepted, taking a position that allowed him to be home most nights rather than riding the dangerous routes, home. The word still felt new on his tongue, but increasingly right. After that first night in town, he'd never really left Zora's side, first helping clear the burnt remains of the old homestead, then assisting with planning and construction of the new. Somewhere along the way, his tender feelings had blossomed into something deeper, matched by Zora's own cautious but growing affection. The music stopped, and moments later Zora joined him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "Shoulder bothering you?" she asked, noting how he was rotating it carefully. "Just stiff. The weather's changing." He smiled down at her. "Nothing that won't improve with use." She studied him with those perceptive green eyes, now more often alight with humor than shadowed by wariness. "You're thinking something." "I can tell by that look. Just that I'm the luckiest man in the Wyoming territory." He turned to face her fully. "Zora, I've been meaning to ask you something." Her expression grew serious, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment. "What is it?" Jackson reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box he'd carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I know we've done everything backwards, faced death together before we'd even properly courted, built a home before making any promises. But I'd like to do this part properly." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small emerald. "Zora Whitaker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Her eyes widened, glistening with sudden tears. For a moment she simply stared at the ring, then raised her gaze to his face. "You're sure?" "Even with all my sharp edges and crooked parts," Jackson smiled, taking her hand. "Especially because of them, they match mine." "Then yes," she whispered, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "Yes, Jackson Lawson, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Jackson reflected that some wounds never healed perfectly straight, be they in shoulders or hearts. But perhaps that was the beauty of it. Two imperfect, scarred people finding in each other not just companionship, but completion. The homestead would never be exactly as it was before. Zora would always carry the grief of her losses. Jackson would always bear the physical reminder of his confrontation with Pike's gang. But together, they had built something new from the ashes, something stronger for having been broken and mended. As winter settled over the Wyoming territory, Jackson and Zora were married in the small church in Twin Rivers. The following spring brought new crops, new calves, and the promise of prosperity. The piano music that drifted from the homestead windows was increasingly joyful, sometimes accompanied by Jackson's deep baritone as he learned the songs Zora loved. 5 years after Pike's attack, the Lawson homestead was known throughout the region as one of the most welcoming and successful. 2 children played in the orchard where once their parents had fled for their lives, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and a copper-haired girl whose laughter was the sweetest music the homestead had ever known. On quiet evenings, Jackson would sometimes massage his aching shoulder while Zora played the piano, both of them silently acknowledging the scars that had brought them together. Crooked healing, they had learned, didn't mean broken, merely uniquely shaped to fit precisely with another's jagged edges, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either could have become alone.